created, and can you give me any idea about the specific locations?
Well, look, we also said at the time that there would be an 18-month study programme where we work out both design and indeed work share for this submarine. That is drawing to a close, and we are waiting obviously for the Australian government as a whole to make its decision on what AUKUS looks like. I think given the amounts of money that Australia will be spending on this enterprise, the need for international collaboration, and the fact that in Barrow-in-Furness and Faslane we have one of the very centres of excellence globally that will help deliver it, I'm confident that all those statements will turn out to be exactly as they were made. And just to give some indication, we are increasing the number of jobs in Barrow already from 10,000 to 17,000 people in order to fulfil both the Dreadnought programme, the nuclear deterrent, and indeed the next generation of Britain's attack submarines.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank my right honourable friend for the considerable effort that his department, the government and the Navy have put into securing this important agreement. It was heartening at the commissioning of HMS Anson to see representatives from the Royal Australian Navy and also the Australian government present, and also the announcement that Australian submariners will be training on that vessel too. With that in mind, would my right honourable friend agree with me that this agreement is absolutely crucial to securing a new geopolitical and strategic agreement with Australia, the US and the UK on areas such as subsea and cyber to keep us safe?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. And look, Barrow-in-Furness, Devonport and Faslane are key components in delivering our nuclear submarine capability and can almost not be replicated around the world. And it's very, very important we recognise, especially in the skills. Look, when Australia chose to go for nuclear submarines as an option, it did so because it recognised about 5 countries on Earth can do this, and it is important if it wants to retain a strategic edge in the Pacific and its part of the world against any future adversaries. We know that. That's what we did for the last 70 years in the Atlantic alongside our American friends. Australia, I'm delighted, are joining that programme.
Martin Dockett to use.
Mr. Speaker, the AUKUS deal was supposed to be the defining agreement of the Indo-Pacific tilt that this government said in the integrated review, I'm sure the Secretary of State will remember, was to make the UK the European partner with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific. Now, given today's news and the combination of historic defence cuts and inflation are going to make the high hopes of the integrated review harder to fulfil this time, I wonder, can the Secretary of State inform the House whether it will still be the UK's aim to be the European partner with the broadest and most integrated presence in the Indo-Pacific?
It's right to ask those questions. It is still our ambition, and so far 2 of the planks are already in place. AUKUS, and we'll see the full details, and it is no mean undertaking to commit to helping build another country, build that capability, and be engaged in its training and deployment. That is a very deep and enduring. The United States investment and joining with us all those decades ago has lasted for 70 years in that. That is a tilt by any means basis. But also we've had Carrier Strike Group on its visit only 2 years ago. That's continued and we plan for another one in 2025.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More broadly, Mr. Speaker, what steps is my right honourable friend's department taking to further strengthen and broaden the AUKUS alliance?
The second pillar of AUKUS includes things such as AI, hypersonics and cyber and all sorts of other technologies that are critically vital not only to complement deployment of submarine but also to further engage our collective security. Those are technologies that rarely are shared between nations, but the United States recognises that in order to face up to the end of this decade and the challenges that we make sure we share together both our industries and their industries, but we have protection for all of us from each other's markets to make sure that we share and then get to sell into them as well, which is quite important.
Says Secretary of State John Peelby.
This week, like the Secretary of State, I'll be meeting the Australian Defence Minister and discussing AUKUS with him. I want him to know that there may be a change of UK government at the next election, but there will be no change in Britain's commitment to AUKUS. If done well, this pact could deepen our closest alliances, it could strengthen security in the Indo-Pacific, and it could bring game-changing investment to Britain. So what priority has the Defence Secretary given to building the first subs here, and when will the build plan be announced?
I'm welcome to the right honourable gentleman's support for AUKUS, and I noted a point on a government. There'd be obviously no complacency from the Labour Party opposite Mr. Speaker. I hope they wouldn't repeat what happened once in the 1990s. I think the reality is, it makes good security sense. The Labour front bench this Labour front bench recognises good global security, even though the last one didn't. The questions my right honourable gentleman asked, I have to say, are a matter for the Australians. They will make the decisions ultimately. They are ultimately the customer in the sense of where they're going to spend the Australian taxpayers' money. We, of course, have contributed to the discussion and offer, and Australia will have to make a decision about time, how quick it wants its capability. It will have to make a decision about how much it wants to build in Australia, and it will have to make decisions about what's the right fit for its ambition, Britain or the United States' existing fleet. I suspect that will come sometime in March, if not in February. I'm very happy to keep the right honourable gentleman up to date, but we have put in a good proposition, and our relationships, and I'm delighted he is meeting his counterpart, matter.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
The Ministry of Defence, as the UK's biggest landowner, is delighted to welcome a range of people to use the land, including walkers, mountain bikers, riders, and as long as they use the land responsibly, welcome on the land. No one, however, should receive special treatment.
Dale Zack.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was a memorandum of understanding that facilitated the monitoring of trail hunting on his department's land. Now, sadly, trail hunting is sometimes used as a smokescreen for illegal hunting, and the Defence Infrastructure Organisation has recorded incidents of foxes killed on Ministry of Defence land and the threatening conduct of some hunt staff. So could the Secretary of State tell us whether he was aware of the serious concerns in the DIO over the behaviour of hunts licensed in his name, and what advice was given by officials?
First of all, I'm glad the honourable members raised the MOU. The MOU was put in place without any announcement to Parliament, any informing of members of this House, without even putting it in the library, as normally would be for a change of policy by any government. Now, that was obviously disturbing to then discover this policy existed and gave special treatment to one group of users. Now, I'm sure he doesn't want people to have special treatment. I think everyone has a right to use that land that way. It also coincided with a large donation to the Labour Party at the turn of the century from a whole group of those animal rights people. It's corrupt, Mr. Speaker. That's what that is. Corrupt. A policy unannounced to this House after a funding donation to one political party, and now they're asking for special treatment. Everyone should respect each other on how they use that land. What I am aware of, having now investigated even further, is there are plenty of complaints from other sides, and this is not about size. This is about whether one group gets special treatment.
That's it, Grady.
Yeah. None.
I understand.
Right,
Well, in that case, I don't expect the government. In that case, I don't expect the MOD will be taking any credit for the work that the Conflict Stability and Security Fund does. The reality is that over the years, the government has made a habit of double counting spending to both the ODA target and the NATO 2% defence target. And of course, the Home Office is busy raiding the ODA budget at every chance it gets. Doesn't that do a disservice to what both the NATO 2% target and the ODA target are supposed to achieve?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the connection to the NATO target is somewhat tenuous, but there is a pattern to the honourable gentleman's questions. I think this is the 4th time he's asked this question in orals, as well as a number of written questions. I think his point is principally aimed at Foreign Office colleagues and the Treasury. But if he would like to meet with MOD officials to discuss once and for all the MOD's plans for the uses of ODA, I'd be very happy to facilitate such a meeting.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of budgets and Ukraine, could I invite the Minister to respond to comments from the United States, our closest security ally, which tally with the Defence Committee's own findings that this conflict in Ukraine has exposed serious shortfalls in the warfighting capability of the British Army. This is not about the professionalism of individuals, units or formations, but about the overall combat strength and the equipment they use, as well as the ability to meet increasing demands caused by the deteriorating threat picture.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the United States has said anything about the overseas development assistance budget recently, but I think if you'll indulge, Mr. Speaker, there's a sort of wider point of news. Thank you. I think everybody's clear. The Secretary of State has said many times, as have I and other ministerial colleagues, that serial underinvestment in the Army over decades has led to the point where the Army is in urgent need of recapitalisation. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister get that, and there's a budget coming.
Stephen Hammond.
5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the National Shipbuilding Strategy and the National Shipbuilding Office is supporting our ambition to grow the UK shipbuilding enterprise and support UK jobs. 5 new Type 31 frigates are being built in Rosyth will support more than 1,000 UK jobs. The Fleet Solid Support contract will deliver £77 million of investment and create more than 1,200 jobs in the UK shipyards and many more across the UK supply chain.
I think it's grouped, Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I was informed it had been withdrawn or not. Sorry. With permission, could I group it with number 8? Sorry. Thank you.
Don't worry. That's great, Stephen Hammond.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for that encouraging answer? He will know that offshore support vessels will be required for the Crown Estate offshore wind leasing arrangements, which are due to be tendered. Can he say whether he could do anything to ensure those vessels are made in the UK?
First of all, obviously, those vessels are predominantly a matter for private companies or indeed non-government departments to choose how and why to buy. But of course, in order to try and encourage more UK shipbuilding, we obviously announced last year in the shipbuilding strategy the Home Shipbuilding Credit Guarantee Scheme, which is there to help counter the perverse incentive that it seems to be that other countries' export credits encourage British companies to build abroad. And obviously been working very closely with BEIS on this, and hopefully we'll announce more details soon.
Lord Blackman.
Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his answer thus far. Clearly, as we replace ageing ships and increase the size of the Navy, it's important that we ensure that those ships are built in Britain rather than being built abroad. So what measures will he take to make sure there's a long-term plan to make sure that our shipbuilders can plan for the future?
Point my honourable friend to the National Shipbuilding Strategy that not only puts in place lots of measures such as, for example, the Home Shipbuilding Guarantee Scheme, export credits for foreign buyers, but also a skills plan, yards for the future plan about what a modern yard should look like in order we can compete with European yards that already beat us in too many contracts, but also a shipbuilding pipeline. Incredibly important to indicate to the industry there is a long-term pipeline to come through, but it is also important to recognise that if we're going to be successful like we are in the aerospace industry, we'll need to export. And if we're going to export to other markets, we have to recognise that international collaboration is also part of the process. Do I think Australia and Canada would have bought our Type 26s if we said no way, you're only having British on it? The answer would have been no, and we'd have all suffered in our supply chain as a result.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding what the Secretary of State has said there, we know that there are many aspects of the British shipbuilding industry that does feel that our government has been less supportive of them than some of our competitor nations around the world. And if the government continues to award contracts where large proportions of the work are completed abroad, won't this undermine the British shipbuilding industry? And won't the Secretary of State say something more about how we can ensure more of these ships are actually built within UK shipbuilding firms?
Mr. Speaker, I really urge the honourable gentleman not to listen to the propaganda claptrapted by the union leadership. I went to Belfast recently and met the local unions. I met to Appledore and met the local unions. You know what? They don't agree with their leadership statements and rather bizarre propaganda. Fundamentally, the future solid support ship will be entirely put together and 2/3 of it nearly built or supplied through the UK at the same time as getting £77 million of investment in the yards to modernise the yards in order that our yards compete. For too long our yards have not won contracts, whether from government or private, because we haven't found that the big prime contractors invested in modernising the skills in the yards. And when I meet the workforce, whether it's in govern or whatever, they want to be invested in.
We've got to get through all the questions, not just this first one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll refer the House to my register of interest. Mr. Speaker, as a proud member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I've been lucky enough to visit some of our NATO parliamentary countries, like the US and Spain, who take huge pride in their buoyant shipbuilding sector. The Secretary of State talks about the ships being put together in the country. Can the Minister tell us, with contracts being awarded outside, with large portion of it being completed abroad. How does he expect to keep investment in the UK?
I'm sorry, it's not fair to everybody else. I'm bringing in on supplementary. It doesn't mean you can take all day. Try and answer it, please.
I can guess the memo that was sent from the union to the honourable lady about what to ask. I mean, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, is what I can say is unless we invest in our shipbuilding industry, unless we collaborate internationally, we won't have a shipbuilding industry. We tried it the other way, it didn't work. We have to build collaboratively. And you know what? In the aerospace industry, like in Lancashire, where Mr. Speaker, are from, the Typhoon aircraft is, of course, an international collaboration, and it's a world-beating success, employing tens of thousands of British people.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an answer to a written parliamentary question to me on the 26th of January 2023, the Minister for Defence Procurement said that the Type 32 frigates are a key part of the future fleet. In the National Audit Office report on the equipment plan, the NAO reported that Navy Command withdrew its plans for the Type 32 frigates because of concerns about unaffordability. How can Type 32 frigates be a key part of the future fleet if there are question marks around its affordability?
Well, that's because the Type 32 frigate, when it comes in, wouldn't be till after 2030 or 2031, because it's going to come after the Type 31s, which are obviously being constructed as we speak in Rosyth. What they are going to be, how they're going to be designed and who built them is obviously a matter between now and towards the centre of the decade. It's also important because even if he gets into government, no Treasury will give you a budget for another 7 years forward to make sure that we don't sign on the dotted line before we have the budget in line. But it is absolutely the intention of the Royal Navy to have more frigates and destroyers, including the Type 32.
Number 6, sir.
Secretary of State.
Defence procurement is some of the most complex in government, but our defence and security industrial strategy represents a step change that will see industry, government and academia working closer together, while fundamentally reforming regulations to improve the speed of acquisition and incentives, innovation and productivity. Our acquisition reforms will drive pace and agility into procurement to improve delivery.
David.
I very much tell the Secretary of State I very much agree with him on the need for increased defence expenditure if we are to remain a Tier 1 power. Nevertheless, in every one of the last 25 years, the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have criticised the MOD's procurement of equipment. Poor identification of military needs, poor quality of equipment, slow delivery of projects, an inability to control costs, and a corporate culture too traditional and resistant to change are just some of the criticisms. Does he agree with me that we need to put these issues right if we are to be a Tier 1 power?
I absolutely agree. I also, first of all, it's why I think for the second or nearly third year in a row, under my stewardship, the Ministry of Defence is going to come in on budget or under budget for the first time in decades to make sure that we live within our means. But secondly, I think it's also important to point out, and it is always a challenge for any Secretary of State Defence, that treasuries like to deal in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years. Some of the programmes we're talking about, the Type 31, for example, earlier, Future Solid Support Ship, are decades long. And in that long process of complexity, threat changes, technology changes, inflation changes, and indeed all the challenges are around. And that's important, whether we're going to have governments that invest in long-term infrastructure, whether it's civil or military, to understand that long-term investments is a different risk profile, and that if we do everything year by year, we'll always end up in a similar position.
The Secretary of State will be aware that there are growing concerns about the impact of delays and the management of defence programmes on our defence readiness. So what specifically is he doing to ensure that the UK will meet our UK NATO obligations in full?
Good question.
Well, we're still on track and maintain above 2% of GDP, if that's the obligation the Honourable Lady is referring to, of defence spending, and we're still on trajectory to do that. It is, of course, important, as my honourable colleagues point out across the House, to make sure we get good value for money, and it is also important we try and deliver on time. Some programmes are on time. 85% of defence programmes do actually come on time. The major collaborative ones or the major complex ones over long terms are often the ones that cause us problems. We do need to improve that. We need to make sure we don't overspec, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that also, where possible, we collaborate and indeed improve internal mechanisms that often hold up things.
The UK has some of the highest defence procurement standards in the world, and I'm glad the government is seeking to drive those standards still further under my right honourable friend's leadership. In cooperating with our international friends and allies and partners in particular Ukraine, does the Defence Secretary agree with me? It's absolutely vital that those partners have similar levels of transparency in their defence procurement in order to keep public confidence for support for Ukraine.
Yes. It's very important that not only is actually across the international community that the donations we're all making, the public get a sense of where they're going and how they're being used. And it was important on a recent visit I met with Ukrainians, indeed other international partners, to make sure we put in place some form of assurance so that what we're sending, we know where it is going, because I think soon our public will quite rightly say what's happening to it. But it's also important that we recognise what Ukraine has showed us is that supply chains, whether they're domestic or multinational, have to be supported in order to make sure that at times of need we're able to surge them rather than blowing the dust off and taking months or years to reopen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has indicated Ukraine has made graphically clear that long-term ordering is absolutely vital to the defence industry and to maintain capacity, both machinery and also manpower. So does he accept that the failure to place orders for new submarines, nuclear submarines, between 2010 and 2016, even though there was a clear majority for that in this House, was a major strategic error?
I'm very grateful to my honourable gentleman, because if I'll do a deal with him. I often try and do a deal with my right honourable gentleman opposite. If he admits too that there were not the only example of that. We have all made strategic errors in our defence policies over the last 2 decades because we've had treasuries that have done short term. We have hollowed out as company. Governments after government have wanted more but not wanted to fund it. His government was no different. I was serving in the army under his government. I know exactly what it was like.
Well, Francois.
Sir, the Ajax programme has been so controversial that the Secretary of State personally commissioned an independent review by Clive Sheldon QC into the flow of information surrounding it. Has the Secretary of State yet received Mr. Sheldon's report? When does he intend to publish it? And can he promise the House he will do so in full and unredacted?
First of all, I'm informed by my right honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, that it's coming imminently, and imminently, I hope that means a few weeks, not months. I will read it, and then, of course, I will make sure, certainly, at the very least, the findings are shared with the House, but I'm very happy to have a discussion with the Defence Select Committee about how much we can share with it, subject to if there are any security concerns. The good news is the Ajax is now starting its next phase of its trials. As I've always said to this House, I am determined to fix this troubled programme. We are now on the way to getting through its next most important trials, having passed its user viability trials up until Christmas. So I'm going to try and fix that programme, get it delivered, and at the same time, I'm delighted to learn the lessons.
And Jarvis.
Mr. Speaker, the MOD procures services to administer defence housing and accommodation. It's now over a month since my urgent question, when the Minister said Vivo, Amy and Pinnacle are, I know, in no doubt about the Minister's profound dissatisfaction at their performance. But since then, there have been more cases of poor repair and poor service. So can the the Secretary of State say, specifically with regard to defence accommodation, is the procurement process fit for purpose? And does he have confidence in the current providers?
Well, it's a timely question by the honourable gentleman. This weekend I looked at the different options about whether we can find either compensation or recompense from the providers in the first place, and I get a weekly update on each individual cases, how many cases are in the queues. In some areas they have made progress, in some areas their progress is comparable or better than the private sector. There is still work to be done on it. I'm most concerned about mould and dampness being opening. In areas around heating we have seen some success, but we do expect a better service. My honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, is regularly meeting with them, but it is also important to note that we will keep even their contracts under review, and if we don't get a better standard, then there are other steps I will take.
Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question from my colleague from Barnsley Central is a good one, because the government's failure on defence procurement isn't limited just to weapons and ammunition. You only need to speak to those people in defence housing with leaky roofs, black mould and broken boilers to realise that defence procurement is failing the people who serve our military and their families. The MOD last year paid £144 million to private contractors to maintain these service families' accommodations, yet many of these homes are still waiting repairs, not getting the service that they deserve. So as one of his ministers has admitted, these contracts do not represent value for taxpayers' money. Why did the MOD sign these contracts in the first place? And when will he be able to tell all our troops that they have a home fit for heroes?
But we always want our homes to be fit for the men and women of our armed forces, and I distinctly remember my time in Germany and indeed in the UK living under a standard of home when it was done in-house. And I can assure you there were issues then, if not in some cases worse. What we have been monitoring, however, is making sure we get these reports answered. It was interesting that the start point of some of these problems was the lack of manning of the very beginning, the helpline, when people were ringing up at Christmas, there was almost no one there, and then working through this whole process. Look, we are going to do more about it. We will hold them to account. We will take financial action against them or whatever if we have to, and I'm not shy about doing it. We will try and seek compensation for those people suffering and improve what's happening. But we are also seeing in some areas that waits over 5 days are getting better, and that's the first point, and then we're getting closer.
Deb Dugan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Multiple major procurement projects for which the Submarine Delivery Agency is responsible for are late or over budget, or often both. Taxpayers are used to the concept of bonuses, but in the real world these bonuses are linked to performance. And those same taxpayers are hemorrhaging billions of their hard-earned taxes on the demonstrable failures of the MOD, not the least of which is within the SDA. So how can the Secretary of State justify six-figure bonuses to executives of failing MOD agencies? And on the eminently reasonable supposition that he can't defend the indefensible, what will he do to rectify those incoherent remuneration packages going forward?
What the payments represent is that we have made a number of new appointments and are turning around the Submarine Development Agency to improve the availability. One of the areas of deep concern has been the consequences of hollowing out over the decades, has been about the maintenance and the availability of dry docks and others and things like Devonport that allow us to turn submarines round to make sure they are maintained in time to get them to better availability. It's important, it is going well, it is important, Mr Speaker, to sometimes change the workforce and make sure you get the best capable people you can to change it around. I'm confident that the new team is able to do that, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results.
Question 7, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer numbers 7 and 17 together. Mr Speaker, on Thursday I had the very great pleasure of visiting Lancashire. In particular, Veterans UK at Norcross, where I met some really great people providing a range of support to our veterans. One of the biggest impediments to progress is around data. Consequently, we are putting 40 million into a transformation programme which will digitise our existing processes, enabling our staff to provide more effective and efficient support to our personnel and veterans, and substantially improving their experience.
Robin Miller.
Mr Speaker, our veterans and their families have made an invaluable contribution to securing our freedoms and our nation, but broadly only about a quarter of them are in receipt of a pension which entitles them to support from the Veterans Advisory Pensions Committees across the UK. Will the Minister join me first in paying tribute to the work of the APCs in supporting veterans, and secondly, will he support my private member's bill on February the 24th, which seeks to extend their remit and expand the cohort of veterans to whom they can offer assistance?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. VAPCs provide a wonderful and unsung service, as did the war pension committees before them. And of course, I look forward to the 24th of February and will give his bill my wholehearted support.
Murray Rimmer.
Mr Speaker, those prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to keep our country safe should not have to rely on benefits to get by. How does the Minister plan on helping veterans reliant on universal credit acquire the skills they need to access well-paid employment?
Very grateful to the Honourable Lady. She'll be aware of the Career Transition Partnership. She will be aware too of the special arrangements that exist for those veterans who are unfortunately ill or injured to get them into civilian life in a seamless way and provide them with the skills that they need for the rest of their lives. It's important to understand that all servicemen and all servicewomen are civilians in waiting. They all return to the communities from which they're drawn, and throughout their careers they will have preparation to enable them to do so in as seamless fashion as possible with the skills that they need.
James Sunderland.
Mr Speaker, thank you. The Minister will know that the Veterans All Party Group are currently running a survey into the experience of veterans across the UK when claiming compensation war pensions and other fiscal support for Veterans UK. That survey closes tomorrow, so will he please agree to meet me to discuss the findings of that survey, and depending on what they say, does he agree in principle to any measures which better assure the outputs of Veterans UK?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable and gallant friend for his chairmanship of the Veterans All-Party Parliamentary Group and for the survey that he has undertaken. I am very much looking forward to the results of that survey. He'll be aware that MOD, of course, itself does a variety of surveys and canvassing to ensure that we are giving our serving personnel, our veterans and their families, what they need to pursue their careers and their lived experience that is positive. But I'm very much looking forward to what his group has to say, and of course I'll meet with him.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The Minister will know and appreciate that mental ill health affects disproportionately veterans and their families. The cost of living crisis is putting even more pressure on access to mental health services, according to veterans' charities. The Labour Party has committed to a £35 million investment in veterans' mental health. I ask this sincerely of the Minister. Will he match that?
Well, firstly, I have to correct the honourable gentleman. He's not right to say that veterans, or indeed defence personnel, are more likely than the general public to suffer from mental health problems. The reverse is the case. However, it is absolutely essential we do all in our power to promote the mental health of our men and women. Absolutely right. And he will be aware of a number of projects, including Op Courage, and throughout people's careers in which their mental health is promoted. And we will continue to do that. But he does need to understand that defence is a positive experience for the vast majority of people who experience it.
Shadow Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The initial headline findings of the independent review of the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme state that the process is overly burdensome and even distressing for the claimant due to unreasonable timeframes and a lack of transparency. This is but one of a number of concerns raised about the compensation scheme, all of which veterans across the country have been telling us about for a very long time. Veterans who have made huge sacrifices to keep our country safe deserve far better from this government. So can the Minister tell the House when the full report will be published and what he's doing to ensure its findings will be acted upon swiftly?
Well, the Honourable Lady is referring to the quinquennial review, which has published its interim findings and will publish its definitive report in the spring. She's right to highlight some of the findings of that report in its interim form, and of course we'll take into account all of those, well, if the Honourable Lady will allow me, in the spring when the report is published. One of those things, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that the system is less adversarial than it previously has been, but we have to understand that a lot of the delay is baked in because of the need to obtain proper, full, comprehensive medical reports.
Sir Robert Lee.
Number 10, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Type 32 programme began the concept phase on the 21st of September 2022 and will seek to deliver an outline business case in spring 2024. The programme and procurement strategy will be decided following the concept phase in the normal way.
But further to the exchange between the Secretary of State and the Shadow Minister earlier this afternoon, can the Minister confirm that whilst I understand that this Type 32, so-called, won't come on stream until 2030, the government is fully committed to having an ongoing warship programme. It doesn't matter whether we call it the 31A or 32 or whatever. We remain committed to renewing the Royal Navy's capability after 2030.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and last week I had the pleasure of being in Rosyth where we were cutting steel, or steel was being cut in respect of Type 31, and that is an affordable frigate which is able to be configured for the mission, so whether that's a humanitarian mission, or war-fighting mission, or anti-piracy mission, that is exactly what we want our frigates to be, flexible, and we want them to ensure that there's a pipeline into the future.
Mr. Speaker, the UK, our allies and partners are responding decisively to provide military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. The UK has led the world with the gifting of modern main battle tanks to Ukraine and are engaging international partners through a coordinated military and diplomatic effort. The Secretary of State for Defence, my honourable friend, should take some personal credit for this, as at every turn throughout the last year it has been him that has sought to understand what the Ukrainians need next and has rallied support across Europe and beyond in that gifting.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his answer, and can I concur with him that we have shown the way on Ukraine? We've consistently been at the forefront. And he mentioned battle tanks, and it was our announcement that set the precedent that let our allies make their announcements last week. In the same vein, can my honourable friend confirm that we will continue to lead the way on support for Ukraine by pushing our allies to match our commitment that we will send as much military aid to Ukraine this year or more than we did last year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government has already committed the same amount of money for this year as it did for last, so in that sense the job is already done. But of course, how the money this year is used will depend very much on what's going on the ground. And that's the most important part of this gifting programme. The relationship between the UK and Ukraine is now so strong that we're able to discuss very candidly each other's plans and to make sure that we're supporting them every step of the way.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, we heard before Christmas that the government had finally signed a contract to replenish NLAWs, but in order to ensure that we can continue to be a leader in the international effort in Ukraine, how many other contracts have been signed to replace the consumable military aid which has been sent to Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, high-velocity missiles have already been placed on contract and other systems that have been donated, many of them were already in the process of being updated and they were gifted coming to the end of their life within our current inventory, and thus they wouldn't be expected to be placed on contract because they're part of a routine procurement process.
SNP spokesperson Dave Duke.
Mr. Speaker, much of the international support going to Ukraine will be deployed to defend Ukrainians against the barbarity of the private militia, the Wagner Group. So can the Minister explain to the UK's allies why the UK government made available frozen assets of Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, in order that he could take a case out against a British journalist? And given this inexplicable accommodation, can the Minister confirm, does this Tory government roll out the red carpet exclusively for Russian warlords, or is this an inclusive UK service available to war criminals everywhere?
Mr. Speaker, the presence of Wagner on the front line in the Donbass is clearly a reflection of just how bad things have got for Putin and the Russian armed forces, that a mercenary group recruiting from prisons is required. As to the substantive part of the honourable gentleman's questions, sounds like it might be a question for my Treasury colleagues, and I'll make sure that they write to him with an answer.
Number 12, please, sir.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer number 12 together with 18 and 20. The Ministry of Defence works closely with British industry and academia, including SMEs, to identify and invest in innovative technologies that address our most pressing capability challenges, as well as publishing our future priorities to incentivise investment. We are already testing and deploying those technologies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The best innovation isn't necessarily the preserve of the giant players in the sector, but smaller enterprises such as those found at the Westcott Venture Park in my constituency, like Flarebright's development of autonomous drones for flight in GNSS-denied areas. So can my honourable friend assure me that these smaller, dynamic enterprises are as valued to his department when it comes to developing new defence innovations as the more traditional big beasts?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. A lot of the innovation does indeed come from those agile SMEs, and that's why the MOD's SME Action Plan is very firmly aimed at improving access for SMEs to work right through the defence supply chain. The MOD indeed has a target that 25% of its procurement spend will go directly and indirectly to SMEs, which is up from around 16% in 2016. Latest figures I've seen, we're at 23% already. We're on the right path, further to go.
The Tempest fighter jet and the Challenger 3 tank are examples of this government's commitment to giving our forces good quality equipment. But does my honourable friend agree that we must also prioritise the well-being of our personnel? And one of the ways we can do this is to ensure that the quality of their food matches the calibre of their kit.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. He is, of course, absolutely right. Ensuring that our service personnel receive good quality meals is a vital contribution to defence capability. And that's why the Ministry of Defence has established a team of subject matter experts to overhaul and modernise defence catering delivery, using the findings of the Delivering Defence Dining Quality Review and the ongoing Army Eats trials to inform change to the total food offer. The trials began in 2020, the results are expected imminently, and that will inform the future of dining for defence.
Well, come on, Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we want to keep our country safe, we need to work with our allies to make sure that we remain at the forefront of the latest developments in defence technology. Can my right honourable friend therefore confirm that our partnership with Japan, or our new partnership with Japan and Italy, will involve collaborating on areas such as weapons and UAVs, and not just on fighter jets?
My honourable gentleman. So the ambition of this truly international programme is principally to deliver a cutting-edge fighter aircraft providing a credible deterrent to future threats. But, as he knows, this is a system of systems, and it's likely to include uncrewed aircraft, new sensors, weapons, advanced data systems and secure networks. And those wider capabilities may be developed together with wider partners, or indeed together with our existing partners in that endeavour. We will continue to explore system opportunities both between our core partnership and more widely.
Margaret Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the recent Memorandum of Understanding signed by the RAF in Imperial College London, how do ministers expect this will impact the RAF's technological capabilities, particularly around digital and artificial intelligence?
Well, of course, digital and artificial intelligence are absolutely central to RAF capability. I was delighted to announce recently significant investment that is taking place in Lincolnshire to ensure that when those aircraft take to the skies, they have all the weapons system, but also the battlefield management plans that they require to ensure that they can take the fight to the enemy.
Ford.
Number 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the National Security Bill contains provisions that will help in prosecuting those who use their knowledge and expertise to train foreign militaries prejudicial to the interests of the UK. In the meantime, while the bill passes through this House and the other House, we've issued guidance to all defence personnel at risk and reminded personnel of their obligation to protect sensitive information. This has led to improved reporting of suspicious activity.
Richard Ford.
I thank the Secretary of State for that helpful response. Qualified RAF pilots are quitting for better paid jobs that involve training other countries' air forces. And fixed-wing aircraft have dropped by nearly a quarter since 2017. We learned last week that all of the RAF's Hawkjet trainer aircraft have been grounded because of an engine issue. Given that the government will be in the High Court tomorrow in an effort to justify supplying arms for use in the war in Yemen, what does he have to say to MPs across the House who are concerned about the deployment of RAF personnel to Saudi Arabia in the last couple of months to train the Royal Saudi Air Force?
I have absolutely no problem with supporting our friend and ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. We've done it for decades and will continue to do so.
We come to Topicals, Mary Kelly-Foy.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Stay.
Mr. Speaker, colleagues may have read reports this weekend about activity conducted by the Army's Counter-Disinformation Unit in 77 Brigade. Online disinformation from foreign state actors is a serious threat to the United Kingdom, which is why during the pandemic we brought together expertise from acts across government to monitor disinformation about COVID. 77 Brigade is a hybrid unit of regular and reserve personnel that has established in 2015. It delivers information activities as part of broader military effects against hostile state actors and violent extremist organisations based outside the UK. It uses publicly available data, including material shared on social media platforms, to assess UK disinformation trends. It is not to be involved in regulating, policing or even reporting opinion that it may or may not agree with.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Daniel was medically discharged from the Army in 2015. Yet in September 2022, Daniel was only awarded Tariff 10 compensation. He's housebound and fully reliant on his mother, and psychiatrists agree that his condition is sadly permanent. 7 years on, and Daniel is still without the compensation that reflects the severity of his mental injury. So will the Minister meet with me to review this case and ensure that veterans who suffer psychological injuries are equally compensated with those who suffer physical injuries?
Hear, hear. I'll be delighted to meet with the Honourable Lady to discuss the case.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been to see some of the RAF housing in Coston recently, and with mould in homes with children present or repairs that have been requested but not completed, it seems that the Pinnacle-Vivo partnership is failing military families. What are ministers doing to hold them to account?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. I know Bryce quite well. I know the accommodation that he's referring to. He may be aware that all TLBs are meant to be assessing now their accommodation against the Defence Housing Standard and will report by the end of the year. In the meantime, he should know that 10 billion over the, 1.6 billion over the next 10 years will be invested in barracks accommodation to improve some of the truly awful accommodation that sadly our men and women have to put up with.
Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month, the government made important, but again, ad hoc announcements of more military help for Ukraine. We're still waiting for the 2023 action plan of support for Ukraine, first promised by the Defense Secretary last August. Will he publish this ahead of the first anniversary of Russia's invasion next month?
Look, I do totally agree with the right honourable gentleman that we need to set out a plan, but can I also tell him, and I've chased it in advance of these questions from the previous question, our donations are not ad hoc. Right? There is a view abroad that somehow these are just ad hoc and the Ukrainians pick up the telephone. Fundamentally, these donations are set by what happens on the ground, by the reaction to the Russian, to Ukrainian defence, and how Ukraine needs to adapt. It's not an ad hoc thing. It's a very deliberate process, mainly called by the United Kingdom and her allies, and therefore it's really important to separate that from an overall strategy about announcing to Parliament the different lines of effort that we take to counter Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Defence Secretary said the armed forces had faced what he called a consistent hollowing out under Labour and early Conservative governments. But when Labour left government in 2010, Mr. Speaker, the British Army stood at over 100,000 full-time troops, and we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. The serious hollowing out has happened since. Who does he think's been in charge over the last 13 years?
You only have to, Mr. Speaker, listen to the veterans on this side to understand their experience under a Labour government. Snatch Land Rovers, let's remember that, and all that awful mess as a result of the Labour government's investment. The deal here is quite simple. If the right honourable gentleman opposite wants to be the next Secretary of Defence, he should come here and get off his chest the shortcomings that his former government did. I'm happy to say that we have hollowed out and underfunded. Will he do the same, or will he hide behind petty party politics?
Butler. Well,
Speaker, last week I visited His Majesty's Naval Base Clyde with the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme and want to pay tribute to the absolutely remarkable men and women we met there who make up our nation's submarine service. Given that we live in ever more dangerous times, can my right honourable friend confirm to the House that this Conservative government remains absolutely committed to delivery of the new Dreadnought class of submarines to be based in Scotland to provide a continuous at-sea deterrent and so protect our United Kingdom for decades?
So I'm glad that my honourable friend and many other colleagues went to Faslane last week and that they enjoyed their visit. We are, of course, committed to the replacement of Vanguard submarines with Dreadnought, but more importantly, he mentions the brilliant people based at Faslane who deliver day in, day out our nation's nuclear deterrent, unseen under the oceans of the world. They are incredible people doing amazing work.
Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is surely right that non-UK veterans who settle here after their service do not pay visa fees, but it is surely not right that this doesn't extend to their dependents. Will the Minister match our commitment on these benches to change that?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I can't give him the undertaking that he asked for me. I'll understand that. Obviously, all things are kept under review, but we do value the service of those from overseas who serve in His Majesty's Armed Forces, clearly, and I think most of them have a very positive experience.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We ought to be extremely proud of the government's impact. We are the second largest supplier of military equipment to the Ukrainians in the entire world, only second to the United States of America. Today we have our troops training the Ukrainian troops on how to use the Challenger 2 tanks. Can I ask the Minister when those will be deployed onto the battlefield so we can start to see a serious impact in bringing this heinous war to an end?
Well, obviously, for security reasons, my honourable friend, I can't tell my honourable friend exactly the timings. What I can say is it starts with training on the individual operation of the platforms, then on training on being able to join together with formation units to fight as a formed unit, because that's important, and then from then those tanks will be put in. What I can say is it'll be this side of the summer, or May, it'll be probably towards Easter time.
Mike Ainsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 45% of Cheshire military personnel are living in the lowest standard of single accommodation. That's 220. That's pretty shameful. And something needs to happen about it quite urgently. How does the Minister ensure that they have homes genuinely fit for heroes?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. 97% of MOD service family accommodation meets or exceeds the government housing standard. However, that's better than most local authorities and better than most registered social landlords. And he may be interested to know, because I looked it up earlier, that 105 homes in his Labour-controlled local authority that are owned by that local authority are below the decent home standards, and I suggest he takes it up with his council.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will join me in thanking the wonderful team at the Defence National Rehabilitation Centre, which is based in Rushcliffe, for the amazing work they do treating injured members of our armed forces. Can I ask the Minister what assessment he's made of how the expertise and the cutting-edge technology at that centre could be shared with our Ukrainian allies to help rehabilitate Ukrainian heroes who are injured on the front line?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. As it happens, last Monday I visited the Defence Medical Rehabilitation Centre. I also heard about the NHS-led National Rehabilitation Centre that hopefully will be stood up by the end of next year, and together they will be able to provide a truly trailblazing international centre for rehabilitation and for research. Obviously, this country stands by to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin in any way possible, including in the rehabilitation of its brave men who have given so much, not only in the defence of Ukraine, but also in defence of the rest of us.
Mr. Speaker, Labour's dossier of the waste in the MOD found that at least 15 billion has been wasted in taxpayers' money since 2010. Can the Minister explain why the government is failing to get a grip of the defence procurement process to secure value for money for the taxpayer?
It's a really wonderful dossier as far as dodgy ones go, because half the waste was under Labour government in it.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Speaker, will the Secretary of State join with me in applauding Poland's historic announcement today that it's raising its defence budget to 4% of GDP? And can he imagine what conclusion I think our government ought to draw from that example?
My right honourable friend always tempts me. I think the Poles who are on the front line and have shown tremendous leadership in the face of Russia's growing aggression, not only to itself but also to its neighbours and friends in Ukraine. I think the conclusion they have drawn is the world is a dangerous, unstable place, and it's not likely to get less so anytime soon.
Dan Carden.
Mr. Speaker, the call for evidence for the LGBT Veterans Independent Review revealed that the police records of veterans convicted during the ban on homosexuality were destroyed. Now, in answers to parliamentary questions, the Department says this was in line with data protection, but in letters to veterans, it says this decision was taken by Defence Police Chiefs Council, who directed that all investigations into offences relating solely to sexuality were to be removed from our systems and deleted from the records. Can the Secretary of State or Ministers write to me to clarify this, and will they consider making the Council meetings with the Defence Police Chiefs public?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this. Between 1967 and 2000, there's no question that people in the LGBT community were badly dealt with by Defence, and that's why we've set up the Etherton Review, which will report shortly. And I can tell you, having met with Lord Etherton, that he will be forensic in his examination of the data. I think I can assure the honourable gentleman, however, that the handling of records, as far as we can tell, was in accordance with civilian practice. But of course we stand by and wait for his lordship to opine on the matter and will comment further when he has done so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend set out what preparations his department have made in terms of the support for overseas territories in the Caribbean during this year's hurricane season?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I enjoyed working with my right honourable friend when she was the Minister for the Overseas Territories, and she's right to care about this. She will know that the Department has done a lot of work over the last few years to develop the resilience of the Overseas Territories, as well as maintaining naval assets in the region and more at readiness to assist if required.
Maybe a permanent base in the Ortiz would help. Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During my recent visit to Ukraine with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green, Ukrainian officials were very clear about their need for increased military support. With the United States reportedly discussing the creation of a fighter jet coalition with Ukraine, and the German Chancellor currently ruling out sending fighter jets to Ukraine, what assessment has the government made regarding building such a coalition with their NATO allies?
Well, having taken the battle on getting tanks into Ukraine, obviously, understandably, people then ask about what next capability. I think what we know about all these demands is that eventually the initial response is no, and it ends up being yes. So we will see, we will track the progress, but as I say, it is not based on ad hoc. It's based on need and defined what's needed on the battlefield. Of course, we will keep our minds open all the time about what is possible to do next.
Dame Caroline Downage.
Speaker, I warmly welcome the announcement of £1.6 billion to repair and refurbish on-site base accommodation. As the Minister rightly says, the accommodation in both HMS Sultan and HMS Collingwood is truly awful. Meanwhile, we hear that in the Portsmouth area alone, the Royal Navy are spending millions of pounds a year putting people up in hotels, while Fort Blockhouse, within my Gosport constituency, which he knows very well, remains empty. When are the MOD going to address this?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I know she knows the Fort Blockhouse intimately, as indeed do I. It's aesthetically charming, but it is beyond reasonable repair in terms of accommodating servicemen and servicewomen are concerned. We're spending money on HMS Collingwood. I hope it will be brought up to spec shortly.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, veteran Samantha O'Neill, a week today will be made homeless from a hostel by City of York Council, who is a signature to the Armed Forces Covenant. What steps can he make to ensure that she and her 3 children are not homeless a week today?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Obviously, I can't comment on the details which I don't have. If she sends to me, I will certainly look into them. But every local authority that signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant needs to be mindful of its duty to look after servicemen, servicewomen and their families.
The Charities Saluter reported 133 women, a third of their caseload, last year presented to them having suffered a sexual assault. They presented at the Defence Community Mental Health Services but subsequently discharged from the military due to having a personality disorder. I wrote to the Minister for further information. None was available. So would the Minister look into the service to make sure that due clinical rigour is applied before people are discharged with a personality disorder?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend and predecessor. I've seen no evidence that people are being misdiagnosed or mismanaged. The matter, of course, is for healthcare professionals, in particular consultant psychiatrists. I can't really interfere with their diagnoses. I've noted her concerns, and I will certainly look into the matter.
Boris Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, would the Secretary of State agree with me that what we've learned from Ukraine, surely, is the future of good defence is going to be in having the latest technology and innovation? Are there any new schemes that we could have that increase the investment in that new technology, and especially partnership with other countries across NATO?
He's absolutely. First of all, the Diana unit within NATO, I'm delighted we jointly share the European headquarters with Estonia, because I felt it was important to partner with a small, innovative country to make sure we get the very best between us. That's one of them. Our R&D budget is £6.6 billion, one of the leaders in government in investing it. But of course, the real lesson, which has always been a problem, is not only is it important to invest in the inventions, it's pulling it through into an actual requirement. That's traditionally where the defence has fallen down. I'm determined to fix that, and that means focusing our R&D where we know there's a need by our armed services.
Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. Many veterans in East Devon tell me they sometimes struggle to adapt from frontline service into jobs available locally. It is a huge change. The scars of service can be challenging. Can my right honourable friend provide an update on the work of the Defence Transition Service, which supports veterans into good, well-paid jobs?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He might be referring to the Career Transition Partnership, which is the partnership that is normally used for people transitioning into civilian life. The DTS is for those who have in some way been injured or have sustained an illness. That is designed to make sure that people have the support they need to adapt to their particular circumstance, ensure they have the best chance possible of getting a decent civilian job after they leave the services, and it's very successful in so doing it, as is the CTP.
Recent news reports detailing 14,500 urgent maintenance appointments at Armed Forces homes being missed are very concerning. So would my right honourable friend reassure me and my constituents in Southend West he is taking every step to ensure all our soldiers can live in good quality homes?
Well, absolutely. It's a top priority, certainly for me, I know for the Secretary of State and for MINDP. What we have to bear in mind is 97% of those houses are above the government housing standards. So they are better than most councils and better than most registered social landlords. But we must do better than we are at the moment, and we're bending ourselves to that task.
Saxby.
Speaker, can my right honourable friend confirm that UK operational sovereignty will be a factor in the increment 1A of the Maritime Electronic Warfare Programme, and might he meet with me to discuss?
I'm very grateful to the honourable lady for that important question. I will write.
Secretary of State at the beginning of Topicals referred to the allegations in the press at the weekend relating to the 77 Brigade. Now, I know him well enough that when he tells us that he gave clear instructions and guidelines to the brigade to only operate against foreign powers and extremists, he was telling the exact truth. Will he, however, review the issue and ensure that his guidelines have been followed in all cases?
My right honourable friend, thank you for the compliment. Yes, I have, and I've already instructed that we look into not only the story, but indeed my instructions that I personally issued after a visit were carried out.
That completes questions. We now come to the oral statement. I'll just let the room, the chamber clear. We now come to urgent and emergency care recovery plan. I call the Secretary of State for Health.
Mr. Speaker, today we are publishing our new delivery plan for recovering urgent and emergency care services, which has been deposited in the libraries of both houses. After the scale of the pandemic pressures, which healthcare systems around the world and indeed across the UK are collectively facing, we are building the NHS back to where we want it to be. This requires the widespread adoption of innovation, building on best practice already being applied in specific trusts, together with significant investment in these new ways of working, including a £14.1 billion funding boost to health and social care, as set out in the autumn statement. Today's announcement is the second of 3 plans to cut waiting times in the NHS. Our elective recovery plan is already in action, virtually eliminating the backlog of 2-year waits in England. And our primary care recovery plan will be published in the next few weeks to support the vital front door to the NHS through primary care. And today, together with NHS England, we are setting out our plans to reduce waiting times in urgent and emergency care through an increased focus on demand management before patients get to hospital and greater support to enable patients to leave hospital more quickly. That will be through care at home or in the community, supported with a clinical safety net. And in addition, this plan sets out how we will adopt best practice within hospitals, learning from those trusts that have displayed the greatest resilience in meeting the heightened pressures this winter. Mr. Speaker, today's announcement on urgent and emergency care does not sit in isolation. It is part of a longer-term improvement plan building on the legislative change enacted last year to better integrate health and social care through the 42 integrated care boards. Those became operational in July last year. This in turn was prioritised for additional funding through the £14.1 billion announced for health and social care in the autumn statement. Now, following the spike in flu cases over Christmas, with inpatient flu case admissions 100 times that of the previous year, and that spike having extremely quickly a sevenfold increase into December, we announced £250 million of immediate funding on the 9th of January for the pressures this winter, giving extra capacity to the emergency departments to tackle those patients fit to leave hospital who were delayed from doing so. Today's plan, developed in partnership with NHS England and social care partners, builds on those actions and that investment as they set out to the House earlier this month, as we put in place the more substantive changes required to enable the NHS to have greater resilience this time next year. To do so, this plan involves embracing technology and new ways of working to transform how patients access care before and after being in hospital. That in turn will help break the cycle of emergency departments in particular coming under significant strain in winter. Mr. Speaker, our plan has a number of commitments that are both ambitious and credible. First, we are committed to year-on-year improvement in A&E waiting times. By next March, we want 76% of patients to be seen within 4 hours. In the year after, we will bring waiting times towards pre-pandemic levels. Our second ambition, Mr. Speaker, is to improve ambulance response times, with a specific commitment to bring Category 2 response times, those emergency calls including for heart attacks and strokes, to an average of 30 minutes by next March. And again, in the following year, we will work to bring ambulance response times towards pre-pandemic levels. I'm pleased the College of Paramedics has welcomed the plan, saying, quotes, "It is pleased to see a strong focus in the recovery of those people in the Category 2 cohort. And of course, this will not be the limit of our ambition, but it is vital we get these first steps right and that we're credible as well as ambitious. To put these targets in context, achieving both would represent one of the fastest and largest sustained improvements in the history of the NHS. Underpinning these promises, Mr. Speaker, is one more essential commitment, a commitment to better data and greater transparency. On data, the best performing hospitals have benefited from the introduction of patient control centres to quickly identify blockages in a patient's journey, and e-bed management systems to speed up the availability of beds when they become free. Through this plan, we will prioritise investment in improving system-wide data, both within the integrated care boards and on an individual trust and hospital site basis. This will allow quicker escalation when issues arise and a better system-wide response when individual sites face specific challenges. On greater transparency, for some time, voices across the NHS have called for the number of 12-hour waits from the time of arrival in A&E to be published, something I know the Royal College of Emergency Medicine has long campaigned for, and I can see the Honourable Lady nodding her head. And indeed, there has been criticism, including from the benches opposite, of the government for refusing to provide this transparency. Instead, the data published to date has been a measure of 12 hours from the point of admission and not arrival in A&E. Mr. Speaker, for the commitment to transparency to be meaningful, we must be prepared to publish data even when that transparency will bring challenges. And so today I can inform the House that from April we will publish the number of 12-hour waits from the time of arrival. Dr. Adrian Boyle, President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, previously said, and I quote, "The full publication of this data will be an immensely positive step that could be the catalyst for transformation of the urgent and emergency care pathway that should help to improve the quality of care for patients." And I hope it is a transparency that is welcomed across the House. Mr. Speaker, our plan focuses on 5 areas: setting out increased capacity in urgent and emergency care, growing the workforce, speeding up discharge, expanding and better joining up new services in the community, and making it easier for people to access the right care. Action in each area is based on evidence and experience, learning lessons from the pandemic and building on what we know can work. More than that, we're backing our plan with the funds we need, and the government is committed to additional targeted funding to boost capacity in acute services and the wider system. That is why, Mr. Speaker, this package includes £1 billion of dedicated funding to support hospital capacity, building on the £500 million we provided over this winter to support local areas to increase their overall health and social care capacity. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, this plan will cut urgent and emergency care waiting times. It will do so, firstly, by increasing capacity with 800 new ambulances on the road, of which 100 are new specialised mental health ambulances. This comes together with funding to support 5,000 new hospital beds as part of the permanent bed base for next winter. Secondly, by growing and supporting the workforce, and we are on track to deliver on our manifesto commitment to recruit over 50,000 nurses, with over 30,000 recruited since 2019, and the NHS will publish its long-term workforce plan this year. We're also boosting capacity and staff in social care, supported by investment of up to £2.8 billion next year and £4.7 billion the year after. Thirdly, by speeding up discharge of patients who are ready to leave hospital, including freeing up more beds with a full rollout of integrated care transfer hubs, like the kind of successful approach I saw this morning at the University Hospital of North Tees. Fourthly, by expanding and better connecting new services in the community, like joined-up care for the frail elderly. This includes a new fall service, so more elderly people can be treated without needing admission to hospital. Virtual wards are also showing the way forward for hospital care at home, with a growing base of evidence showing that virtual wards are a safe and efficient alternative to being in hospital. Our aim is to have up to 50,000 people a month being supported away from hospitals in high-tech virtual wards, of the sort that Watford General Hospital has been pioneering, which I saw last month. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we're improving patients' experience by making it easier to access the right care, including a better experience with NHS 111 and better advice at the front door of A&E, so patients are triaged to the right point within the hospital without always needing to go through the emergency department, as is currently the case at Maidstone Hospital, as I saw earlier this month. These are just some of the practical improvements already being delivered in a small number of trusts, which through this plan we will adopt more widely across the NHS, and in doing so deliver the greater resilience ahead of next winter. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that NHS Providers has welcomed today's plan and that the Royal College of Emergency Medicine has called it, and I quote, a welcome and significant step on the road to recovery. Taken together with all the other vital work happening across health and care, including our plans to cut elective and primary care waiting times, today's plan will enable better care in the community and at home, and for that care to be more integrated with services in hospitals and for existing practice to be more widely adopted. I commend this statement to the House.
Shall the Secretary of State, West Riding?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, after 13 years of Conservative mismanagement, patients are waiting longer than ever before. Heart attack and stroke victims are waiting more than an hour and a half for an ambulance. 24 hours in A&E isn't just a TV programme, it is the grim reality for far too many patients. 7.2 million people are waiting for NHS treatment. Why? The front door is broken, people are finding it impossible to get a GP appointment, so they end up in A&E. At the same time, the exit door is broken because care in the community is not available. Patients are trapped in hospitals, sometimes for months. And in between the two is a workforce that is overstretched, burnt out, ignored by government ministers, and forced out on strike. Does this plan even attempt to get patients a GP appointment sooner? No. Does this plan restore district nursing so patients can be cared for in the comfort of their own homes? No. Does this plan see ministers swallowing their pride and entering negotiations with nurses and paramedics? No.
And does this plan expand the number of doctors and nurses needed to treat patients on time again? No. The Health Secretary said a lot of things, Mr. Speaker, but he did not say when patients can expect to see a return to safe waiting times. His colleague, the Minister for Social Care, rather let the cat out of the bag this morning. She was asked, and I quote, "Is there any plan at all for when we will get back to 95% of patients in A&E being seen within 4 hours?" She responded, and I'm not joking, her answer was, and I quote, "I can't tell you that." Ridiculous. How can he claim his plan is ambitious and credible? What kind of emergency care plan doesn't even attempt to return waiting times to safe levels? It's a plan that is setting the NHS up to fail right from the start, a plan for managed decline. These targets are not plucked out of thin air. Patients waiting more than 5 hours in A&E are more likely to lose their lives. So are heart attack and stroke victims waiting more than 18 minutes for an ambulance. Sadly, that is exactly what has happened this winter. It is what happened this summer, and it has been going on since before the pandemic began. The 4-hour A&E waiting time target hasn't been met since 2015. The only time the Conservatives have met the 18-minute target for ambulance response times was during lockdown. What's his ambition now? 30 minutes. 30 minutes waiting for a heart attack and stroke victim to receive an ambulance when every second counts. Isn't it the truth that they miss the targets, so they are moving the goalposts, fiddling the figures rather than fixing the crisis? And he boasts that he's pouring more money in, £14 billion, almost as much as his department has wasted on dodgy, unusable PPE. Yet standards are being watered down. So can he explain why patients are paying more in tax but waiting longer for care? Why is it that under the Conservatives we are always paying more but getting less? So what is their answer? I quote again, "There are so many people in hospital who wouldn't need to be there if we could provide quality care at home. Medical science and technology offers a world of possibility for the NHS to transform patient care. Virtual wards allow people to receive hospital care at home." End quotes. Those aren't the Secretary of State's words, Mr. Speaker. That's my party conference speech. He didn't have a plan for the NHS, so he's nicking Labour's. Now, I'm happy for him to adopt Labour's plans, but here is what he missed. You cannot provide good care in the community, in people's homes, or in the hospital without the staff to care for people. That is the supermassive black hole in his plan published today. People. Virtual wards without any staff isn't hospital at home, it is home alone. So where is his plan to restore care in the community? Labour will double the number of district nurses qualifying every year. So can he hurry up and nick that plan too? And of course, good care in the community is not a substitute for good care in hospital. We need both now. So why, in the middle of the biggest crisis in the history of the NHS, with hospitals so obviously short of staff, is his universities minister writing to medical schools to tell them not to train any more doctors? This is ludicrous. Labour will double the number of medical school places and create 10,000 new nursing and midwifery clinical placements, all paid for by abolishing the non-dom tax status. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister might not like that last bit. The Prime Minister might not like that last bit. They're all complaining opposite, but they didn't complain when they put up income tax, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister doesn't like it, but perhaps this would be a good time for the Conservatives to act tough on tax dodgers. So when is he going to nick that plan? And when is he finally going to get his act together and end the strikes in the NHS? Or perhaps I'm speaking to the monkey when the Chancellor is the organ grinder. If that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then when will we get a chance to question the real Health Secretary on the strikes this one is causing in the NHS? Labour will create more front doors in the NHS. We will tackle the crisis in social care. He offers sticking plasters, and by now, Mr Speaker, it's very clear only Labour can offer patients the fresh start the NHS needs.
Well, Mr Speaker, he started off by thanking for advance sight of the statement and then gave a series of remarks that simply ignored what was in the statement. And even his last point just shows how riddled with contradictions the approach from the opposition bench is. He says in interviews that he supports the pay review body process. That is the official position, or at least was. Then he says, no, we should be negotiating individually with the trade unions and disregarding the pay review process. So there's no consistency on that at all. He talks about operational performance. You just had your go. You can hear the answers. He says that it's about operational performance. And I, Mr Speaker, in my remarks, try to be fair to the fact that actually these are challenges that are shared across the United Kingdom. They're shared globally. He seemed to think that these were just unique to England alone, and yet you only need to look at the fact more than 50,000 people in Wales, notwithstanding it's a smaller population, but more than 50,000 in Wales are waiting over 2 years for their operation, when we cleared that in the summer in England with fewer than 2,000 in that cohort. He talks about workforce, Mr Speaker, obviously didn't bother to read what we said in the statement. We're on track to deliver our manifesto commitment of over 50,000 nurses. We've got over 30,000 so far. If one just looks compared to last year, Mr Speaker, 10,500 more nurses in the NHS this year compared to last year. Now, the grown-up position is to recognise, well, the first 5 years we were dealing with the letter that said no money was left. So, you know, so the first 5 years were indeed... They don't seem to like the response, Mr Speaker, but the facts speak for themselves. 10,500 more nurses this year than last year. But the grown-up position is to recognise that we have an older population, they have more complex needs, and the consequences of the pandemic are severe. They're severe in England, but they're severe across the United Kingdom, in Wales, in Scotland, and indeed in other countries across the globe. He says that the statement didn't cover the plan for GPs. Well, again, I was clear that this was one of 3 plans. We had the elective plan in the summer, which hit its first milestone. We have the second component today in terms of urgent and emergency care, and we will set out in the coming weeks through the work that my colleague on the front bench is doing, our approach in terms of primary care. And that is the approach that we're taking. We keep country 30 years. We didn't have the pandemic 13 years ago. So, of course, we... well, I can only surmise, Mr Speaker, that he didn't quite get his remarks right, which is why he feels the need to keep chuntering now and have a second, a third and a fourth go. But perhaps next time. On ambition, he ignores the fact that we need to balance being ambitious but being realistic, and these metrics are, in the view of NHS England, the fastest sustained improvement in NHS history. So clearly he is at odds with NHS England in those remarks. On funding, we're putting in an extra £14.1 billion of funding into health and social care over the next 2 years, which reflects the fact that, notwithstanding the many competing pressures that the Chancellor faced at the autumn statement, he prioritised health and social care alongside education as the key areas that were prioritised, notwithstanding the other competing challenges. And on virtual wards, I hadn't quite realised that he was the clinician that had invented virtual wards. I actually think the credit for virtual wards goes to the staff such as those I met at Watford, who are the ones who are driving forward that innovation. And it's slightly strange that he wants to sometimes claim ownership of something that has been clinically led by those working at the front line. We have recognised its value, and that's why both at Northeast this morning or Watford last month or on various other visits, I have been discussing as to how we scale those virtual ward plans.
Chair of the Select Committee, Steve Bryan.
We look forward to going through the plan with the Secretary of State in detail when he comes to the Select Committee tomorrow. Could I just ask him about the ambition on the 2-hour response to frail and elderly with falls at home to prevent them from being admitted into the acute sector? Obviously, this was committed to in the long-term plan, he will know. What does he need to put this ambition into practice?
Well, we have earmarked the funding as part of the 2.8 billion next year to put that in place. Actually, I think one of the key things is less the funding and the accuracy of the data. It's to be able to see where there are gaps in coverage, how we get the right levels of community response. That is something that ICBs have been set up to take an integrated approach on. And I think one of the best enablers of that will be the control centres that the ICBs will set up, which will allow us to get much greater visibility of where that has been delivered and how we escalate it when it's not.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 300,000 vacancies in health and social care means that his plans, whatever he puts on the table, will never be delivered. So what is he doing to retain the burnt-out, traumatised staff that currently work in the NHS and to resolve their pay dispute and to put enough money on the table to pay social care staff enough to come and work in the service?
Well, we recognise the huge pressure there is on social care. That is why, at the autumn statement, the Chancellor set out the biggest ever increase in funding, 7.5 billion over 2 years, into social care of any government. So we are putting more funding in. In terms of workforce more generally, the Prime Minister has committed, as has the Chancellor, to bringing forward the workforce plan, which will set out the longer-term ambition on workforce and for that to be independently verified. But in addition, we are recruiting more staff, and I updated the House whether it's the 3% more doctors this year compared to last year, the 3% more nurses, the increase, whether it's 40% more paramedics compared to 2010, the 50% more consultants compared to 2010. We are recruiting more staff, but I think the grown-up position is to recognise that there is also more demand.
Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the plan set out by my right honourable friend today. However, he will know that one of the reasons that emergency care faces so much pressure is because successive governments have not focused enough on the prevention agenda. And indeed, last week's news that the government will not be going ahead with individual focus plans on cancer, dementia and mental health has concerned many. So can I ask my right honourable friend just to assure this House that when it comes to the government's new major conditions strategy, that it will be published promptly, it will be comprehensive and significant?
Well, I'm very happy, firstly, to give my right honourable friend that assurance. But I can reassure the House that our commitment to the missions through the Office of Life Science, the cancer mission, the dementia mission, is absolutely that commitment is there. He's right, we are bringing that together in one paper because I think we should take a holistic view of our approach. But I absolutely share his ambition in terms of prevention. I think what I set out in early January was the three-phased approach, which was the immediate response to the pressures we saw from the flu spike over Christmas, the 250 million. The second part of that is what I've just announced today. How do we build greater resilience into the system looking ahead to next winter? And the third element is the major conditions paper, which is around the prevention piece, which is bringing forward the very innovative work that colleagues through the Office of Life Science are doing, and how do we bring that forward into actually impacting the front line of the NHS much sooner than might otherwise have been the case.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to raise the case of a constituent who described to me the state of Salford Royal A&E earlier in January. She said, "My partner was taken by ambulance yesterday at about 11 a.m. He has a severe chest infection and breathing problems. He was left sitting in a chair on oxygen till 10 p.m. when a trolley was found for him to sleep on. There are no beds available. My constituent said that patients and staff feel that no one cares. After such a long wait, my constituent's partner was found to have pneumonia and he's been very poorly. Now the Secretary of State is talking about a target of 76% of A&E patients seen within 4 hours by next March. Will the Secretary of State tell me and my constituent why he thinks it is acceptable for patients to wait longer than is safe?
Well, firstly, Mr. we are bringing times down. I think the current mean response for C2s is much more in the region of 25 minutes, 26 minutes than what it was over the late December, early January period, because there was, as there was across the UK, a massive spike in flu, and she will have seen exactly the same in the Labour-run NHS in Wales. Over December, there's a 20% increase, for example, in 999 calls, but that is why we need to put in place greater resilience. That is what the plan I've set out to the House does.
Sir John Redford.
I strongly support the £1 billion for 5,000 additional beds and 800 more ambulances. It's long argued that with a growing population and a growing elderly population, we need more capacity. Is it also possible to take some of the 14 billion additional money also going in to provide even more capacity, because I think we're going to need it?
Well, I think what's within my right honourable friend's question is how we get more flow into hospital, because I think the key interaction around bed occupancy is once bed occupancy goes above a certain threshold, then actually that drives inefficiency within hospitals because of the lack of flow. That is why we're putting in the extra capacity. It's also about reducing those going to hospital in the first place and speeding up those who are fit to be discharged so that they can leave sooner. So whereas at the moment someone might, for example, sit on a ward for 3 doses of antibiotics a day, if those antibiotics, one continual dose can be administered through new kit at home, that's a much better patient experience, but it also relieves pressure on the wards.
Ezzy Cooper.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the additional transparency on data for 12-hour wait times, because it's only by shining a light that we can see just how bad the problem is. But the targets set out in this plan today are utterly woeful. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine says that we need 13,000 beds. The government is offering 5,000. The percentage of patients that need to be seen within 4 hours should be 95%. The government is aiming for 76. Heart attack and stroke victims should be seen within 18 minutes, and the government is only aiming for 30. Surely the truth of it is that this woeful lack of ambition means that our emergency care services are themselves on life support, and patients are going to continue to needlessly die for a very long time to come.
Well, firstly, can I thank the Honourable Lady for recognising the steps we've taken on transparency. I think that's been an area of challenge, and it is part of my wider commitment to transparency. On the ambition of the targets, I think they've got to be realistic, but it's not a ceiling, it's a floor. It's about saying, how do we set a target that's realistic? Of course, we'll aim to do better than that, but it's about setting something that the system feels is achievable, because that, in turn, gets much more buy-in. On the issue of beds, we are, as my right honourable friend alluded to, increasing the capacity. What it's really about is freeing up those patients who are fit to discharge from hospital, who shouldn't be there, and actually will prefer to be getting care at home. So it's about looking at the end-to-end bed capacity, not simply those within the acute sites.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. In the pandemic, the use of local private hospitals, particularly in places like Basingstoke, by the NHS, kept services like cancer care going uninterrupted. Could the NHS be using more private facilities more widely to relieve some of the pressures that my right honourable friend has so eloquently outlined in his statement?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a really important point, and what's actually, again, within that is patient choice. How we empower more patient choice, providing services are free at the point of use, to use what capacity there is within the system, including the independent sector. So I absolutely agree we should be maximising the capacity. We had a very useful roundtable with the Prime Minister at Downing Street with the independent sector as to how we make more use of their capacity, and it's certainly an area we're exploring.
Derek Chway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I saw for myself only recently, a few weeks ago, the real crisis in our hospitals when I accompanied a close relative to Wiston Hospital and saw there on the corridors every single space taken up by a bed or a trolley or a chair. And quite frankly, what the staff were doing, the doctors, nurses, support staff, was quite amazing, and deserve all our praise for the hard work they're putting in. But it is shows we're in a sort of bizarre situation when the Secretary of State is lauding the fact that we virtually eliminated 2-year waits.
Yes.
Now, I do recall that when Labour left office, it was somewhat less than that, an 18-week target, and many people get seen within weeks, in fact, not just months as well. But let me ask the question to the Secretary of State this. He said they're on the track to recruit 50,000 new nurses. Can I ask him how many nurses have left the NHS in the last 2 years?
Well, firstly, on the recognition of the staff, he's right to recognise the work that staff have been done. And in terms of the family member, again, when I made my statement earlier in January, I recognised there's been huge pressure on the system. We saw those flu numbers in terms of this spike of cases. He also sort of picks up on the point of the 2-year waits. The point I was there is simply contrasting the fact that there has been pressure on services across the United Kingdom, and the 2-year wait is far worse in Wales than it is in England. So if he's making the point in terms of why I'm referencing that, it's because we've cleared it in England, but the pandemic impacts have been there. In terms of recruitment and retention, that is why we're bringing forward the workforce plan to look at that. But the fact is we are recruiting more nurses, but that is also about meeting the demand pressure as well.
Simon Jupp.
There's no doubt the 5,000 extra beds will help support the NHS provide the best possible patient care. Community hospitals across East Devon and our Nightingale in Exeter can play their part too. Does my right honourable friend agree that community hospitals can play a key role to help cut waiting lists?
I think community hospitals are absolutely key to tackling the issue of delayed discharge. I think community settings have been a bit of a Cinderella in the past. The data on community settings tends to be weaker than it is in other parts of the NHS. And I think alongside domiciliary care and making better use of residential care capacity, the third element is to look in terms of discharge at how we use community step down in a much more constricted way. But I think one of the key issues is to put wraparound services so people don't simply get transferred to the community setting, but that is a staging post before getting to the home, which is where most patients want to be.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the social care sector is dominated by very dedicated staff who are paid very low wages, very high profits that are made from it, and an insufficiency of spaces. In the money that he's announced, will it go to local authorities? Can it be spent on public provision? And doesn't he think it's time to recognise the internal market and privatisation has sucked money out of health and social care, which could have been spent on patient care and caring for people both in the community and in special facilities?
Well, I think one area of his question that I do agree with him is the importance of local authorities. And one of the reasons I'm so keen to use more clarity on data and transparency is I think sometimes there can be a tendency for the local authorities to be blamed for discharge, when often it's factors within the NHS as well that are contributing to some of those who are fit to leave hospital not doing so. In terms of the money allocation, the 2.8 billion is targeted to local authorities. So that is funding that the Chancellor set out for 4.7 billion the following year. So we are increasing the money for local authorities, but alongside that, we're working with them to improve the data so we can see where there are blockages due to local authorities. For example, and the Speaker will be familiar with this, but in Blackpool you quite often have people from out of area who visit Blackpool, and so they're dealing with a number of local authorities, not simply the local authority nearest to them. So we're working intently on how we support local authorities as part of the wider discharge package.
Sir David Avenant.
Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and commend his approach to this very difficult problem that he faces and we as a nation face. Would he agree that while speeding up discharge from hospital and freeing up beds for patients needing urgent care and emergency care is absolutely necessary, there's a real need for the expansion of new services in the community, which must be a top priority. In my area, this is one of the biggest issues of why they're bed blocking in hospitals locally, because there's no community service to pick up when people go home.
Well, my right honourable friend hits the nail on the head. He's absolutely right, which is how we better manage demand in the community before people get to the emergency department. And that is where, for example, action particularly targeted at the frail elderly is so important. But also how then, when people are fit to discharge, we enable them to do so sooner so that they can recover, whether in a community setting or ideally at home, with the right wraparound support.
Karen Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Bristol South will be ever so grateful to have data that they're waiting 12 hours rather than perhaps ringing me up to tell me they've been waiting 12 hours. He's a Treasury man. He must know that we are now paying more for less. So in the interest of transparency, can he be assured that in his own ICB, demand and capacity are matched, and he will know that? And how will I know that demand and capacity are matched in my own ICB?
Well, I think she was welcoming the 12 hours transparency. I certainly hope so. In terms of the ICBs, they became operational in July. We are working with them as to how by taking a system-wide view. Firstly, they can baseline where the gaps in data are. And one of the key areas of that is around the community side. So when she talks about matching capacity, part of that's understanding what virtual ward capacity, which conditions that applies to, what the physio wraparound services are, what's available within residential care versus community care, what the domiciliary care packages, as the Right Honourable Member for Islington North touched on in terms of local authorities. So we need to look at the data package across the piece on a system-wide basis. That's why we're setting control centres up. And then I'm very keen to make that much more transparent. Because to be blunt, Mr Speaker, as a Secretary of State, you get the transparency anyway when things go wrong. So rather like her, I'd rather have much more transparent data so ICBs themselves can be better held to account. And indeed, that is what the Hewitt review is looking at in terms of that wider transparency piece.
Richard Villiers.
I really welcome the fact that Barnet Hospital Emergency Department is going to be expanding and improving its facilities, it's taking on new staff, and of course I welcome today's announcement, but can I urge the Secretary of State, this must be effective on the ground soon. There is a real crisis out there. This is a good announcement, but it must be delivered so that patients and staff feel it at the front line as soon as possible.
Thursday.
Mr. I couldn't agree more, and indeed that's why the Prime Minister and I were at North Tees Hospital this morning, where it is effective on the ground. And so what it is about looking at where these measures have been effective at hospitals like North Tees, like Maidstone Hospital, and how we then take that best practice from those hospitals where it is having an effect on the ground, and we do what sometimes has been more difficult within the NHS, which is scale these innovations, get them adopted across the piece.
Mr
Speaker, but there are 165,000 vacancies in social care. There was nothing in the statement about how the Secretary of State will address that. How will the Secretary of State address that? Better terms and conditions?
Well, the way we're dealing with that, Mr Speaker, is through the additional funding put in, so the 500 million for this winter, and it relates to the point a moment ago in terms of what impact on the ground is to give ICBs and local authorities discretion. Some of that 500 million is being spent on workforce, for example, in social care, so there is discretion as to how they spend that, and also in terms of then the funding that will be in place next year, the 2.8 billion of local authority funding and ICB funding that will be in place, and the 4.7 billion the following year.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that Torbay's demographics, particularly the growth in the numbers aged over 85 who are living to good long ages, but at that age needing at least some level of support from the NHS, is obviously creating demand and putting pressures on our systems. With the resources today, what engagement is he planning to have with local ICBs, particularly those who cover areas where the demographics are, shall we say, leading the age and have driven innovation, but will need support in doing so?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important and nuanced point, which is demographic pressure is not evenly spread. It's more concentrated in certain parts of the country than others, and therefore the pressure in terms of ICBs is greater in those areas. So that is why the ministerial team met almost all the ICBs in the run-up to Christmas. We had a series of meetings with chairs and chief execs as part of that discussion. And it's also why we want to bring greater transparency so we can see in terms of right-sizing solutions for the emergency department that those facilities are kept in pace with the increased demand.
Senator David.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my constituent's 11-month-old son had to wait in A&E last night for 8 hours. They find this extremely unacceptable. The waiting experience in our hospital is like being in a disaster zone, and they're not my words, but the words of my constituent. My constituent went on to explain about parents having to sit on floors and wait for hours to be able to be seen, or their children to be able to be seen by a doctor. So I pressed the Minister, is there a plan to return to the standard of 95% of patients who come to A&E to be seen within 4 hours?
Well, as I said in my statement, Mr Speaker, we're not setting out that ambition in this statement because the impact of the pandemic has been so severe. We need to set an ambition which is a target that is ambitious but achievable. And that is what we have done. But I refer to what, for example, the President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine has said. This plan is a welcome and significant step on the road to recovery, and we're pleased to see it released. It's about taking best practice from those areas that are working and making sure those are socialised across the piece. But in terms of the specific case, obviously that is of concern to hear of those individual cases, which are obviously very traumatic for the families concerned. But that is why we have set out this plan and why we're putting in the extra funding.
Sir Julian Lewis.
In 2005 to 2006, there was a campaign within the NHS to close many inpatient beds in community hospitals. I was pleased by the Secretary of State's answer to a colleague earlier when he said community hospitals and beds there have a role to play. In that connection, will he consider again the future of the site of the Fenwick Hospital in Lyndhurst in my constituency, where the inpatient beds were closed and now the NHS is proposing to sell off the site? I would have thought that having a site like that and a bit of imagination could result in increased capacity.
Well, in terms of the individual decisions, that is what we're encouraging the integrated care boards to take ownership of, rather than trying to make all the decisions centrally from Westminster, that those closer to the ground, closer to the issues, actually are empowered to make the trade-offs, and I'm sure he will want to have those discussions with the Chair and Chief Exec of his ICB. But the wider issue in terms of how we make greater use of community sites, not least given the workforce pressures and the different staffing ratios that those have, is absolutely the way that we help get more people out of hospital who are fit to leave.
Mr. Speaker, 10 days ago I shadowed one of the brilliant emergency department consultants at Derriford Hospital who are working their socks off under some very difficult conditions. The additional capacity for beds is welcome, especially because of the structural underfunding and a lack of beds in the southwest. But can I say to the Minister that the doctors and nurses were saying to me they want to slow the flow of people getting to the emergency department in the first place. So can he look again at the mothballed Cavell Centre programme, the Super Health Hub programme, that would have done so much to slow the flow, to deal with collapsing primary care services, and in particular look again at the government's decision to withdraw 41 million from the Super Health Hub from Plymouth. That would have been the national pioneer. That would have shown that this project works and would help our hospitals deal with the crisis they're facing.
So State.
Well, the substance of the point he makes is absolutely right. How do we slow the flow of people going to emergency departments? And then when people are fit to discharge, how do we accelerate that? So the substance he raises is absolutely valid and the right one. That is what schemes like the Community Service Response, the Falls Service, looking at the likes of the North Tees model in terms of getting more staff into the community support, integrating the health and social care side together. As I said to my right honourable friend a moment ago, in terms of individual sites, those trade-offs are best determined by the ICBs, but I'm very happy with Ministerial colleagues to look at any specific proposals that it has, but it's really for the ICBs to be looking at how they best use their estate.
Thanks, Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's clear and credible plan, but when it comes to the uplift of 800 ambulances, which is good news, can I urge him, when it comes to the deployment of those, to look at rural areas first, where the ambulances by definition spend much longer per patient on the road, going in between much more diversity spread out hospitals?
Well, I recognise the point he raises, not least as a rural constituency MP myself, and I think talking, as I'm sure he does too, paramedics, probably the principal cause of frustration of late hasn't been the issue of pay, important though that is, but it has been the frustration over long handover times, which has had a particularly damaging impact. I'm very happy to look at any specific issues within his own area, but he's right on the wider point as to the pressures in rural areas.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. When can the people of Warrington and indeed Halton expect to hear about the new hospital campuses, which are much needed by both communities, with sufficient staff to resource them?
State.
Well, in terms of this statement, Mr. Speaker, it's focused on the urgent and emergency care. Of course, at Health Orals and other occasions, we often discuss the wider capital programme, the increased funding that we're putting into that programme. And I think as part of that, it's also about outcomes, how we get more from that investment in capital. And that is why, through the NHS estate, we're starting to standardise our builds with the Hospital 2.0 programme as the first of those, and we'll be rolling that out more widely to the estate. I'm not familiar with the specific issues in terms of his local site, but I'm very happy to look at that following the statement.
Maggie through.
Mr Speaker, I welcome this recovery plan and my honourable friend's comments on the role that community hospitals have to play in the future. The 16-bed Hopewell ward at Ilton Community Hospital was reopened ahead of this season's winter pressures, but it's due to be decommissioned in the spring. To aid with more efficient planning, will my honourable friend work with my local community health trust and my ICB to ensure these beds form part of the extra beds for next winter, but more importantly, that they become permanent rather than this ad hoc approach we've had up until now?
Well, again, Mr Speaker, the decisions on the estate are principally for the ICBs, but I'm very happy to look at any individual proposal she has as to how we get more flow into the system, which in turn is about putting more capacity into the community.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think I welcome what's being said about the mental health ambulances and trying to divert people with in mental health crisis from A&E. But I'm just a little concerned about whether the people attending the scene in those ambulances will have access to the past records or be able to carry out a risk assessment properly on people in that situation. So if you could reassure me on that, and also whether there will be places to take them to other than A&E. It's one thing saying that you want to divert them, but you do need to have those other resources in place.
Well, the Honourable Lady raises a very fair and important point in terms of what is the wider package alongside the mental health ambulances, which I think are a positive step. Last week I met Baroness Bushcombe in terms of the mental health pre-legislative scrutiny, in terms of the proposed legislation on mental health, which will pick up some of the points that she raises. And the sort of innovation is, for example, empowering people before they have a mental health crisis. For example, on some of the apps that are being developed to put their statement of wishes, to put information that means that when they have a mental health crisis, that is actually very helpful for the paramedic crew. So we're looking at how we use innovation to better give voice to the patient and often do that before they have the mental health incident rather than when the ambulance arrives.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the announcement today, and I think the key thing is it makes a difference in the short term. The Secretary of State will be aware of plans to build a new A&E department at Ipswich Hospital. The plan is for it to open January 2024. What assessment has been made about the difference that could make in the medium to long term in terms of increasing capacity and improving waiting times? And also, would the Secretary of State be prepared to work with me and Hospitals Trust to potentially even expedite plans so it may even happen slightly before January 2024?
Well, in a former role, Mr Speaker, when I was Chief Secretary, I signed off a very significant expansion of A&E facilities, so I hope that reassures my honourable friend in terms of my commitment to putting more capacity into emergency departments, not least because they need a certain level of capacity to be able to put in the same-day access, the triage, the ways of getting flow into the system. In terms of, as I say, the wider site proposal, then clearly the ICB for his area will be wanting to prioritise that.
Ellen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The urgent care and ambulance crisis has been brewing since autumn 2021 in Shropshire, and it's worsened since then. Last week, a doctor went on the record to say that the emergency department was like a war zone and that she feared that in a fire, not everyone would get out alive. In a 6-week period to the 12th of January, a Category 2 response time in Oswestry area was 2 hours and 10 minutes. So will the Secretary of State acknowledge that in some areas the crisis is worse than others, and will he agree to meet with me and the other MPs representing Shropshire to discuss how we progress Shropshire further along this track to solve the urgent care crisis that is so serious there?
I'm very happy to meet with the Honourable Lady and colleagues to discuss further, but I think most people recognise that since the huge pressures from flu over the Christmas period, those flu numbers have come down, but of course there is continued pressure in the system.
Sir Robert Butler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. In particular, I welcome the announcement today of over £26 million of funding to expand the emergency department at Great Western Hospital in Swindon. He knows from his previous incarnation that we work together on this issue. It's particularly important not just for the integration of emergency services, but also the freeing up of other space within the hospital to allow for further beds or other clinical interventions. Does my right honourable friend agree that it is this sort of long-term measure that will
will guarantee future progress in our much-pressed National Health Service.
Well, my right honourable friend has been key to securing the funding. I know he has assiduously lobbied myself and ministerial colleagues to make a powerful case on behalf of his constituents. I think he should be very proud with the outcome that reflects his and his parliamentary colleagues' work on this issue. And he's right, and indeed the case he made was around how this frees up capacity in the system, which will result in much better care for patients in Swindon.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing in this plan to address the fact that there are thousands of people now turning up at A&E as a direct result of the fact that they cannot get regular access to an NHS dentist. Last week, another Cumbrian dental practice in Grange-over-Sands wrote to all of its 5,800 patients to say they had been forced to quit the NHS too. There is now not a single NHS dental place anywhere in Cumbria available. So what will he do to fix an NHS dentistry crisis that leaves a family of 4 having to cough up an extra £1,000 a year during a cost of living crisis to get access to the dental care they've already paid for through their taxes?
Well, I address this point, Mr. Speaker, in that we are bringing forward the third component of our 3 plans, the elective recovery plan, which I spoke about earlier, today's announcement on the urgent and emergency care recovery plan, and the third element will be the primary care recovery plan. And of course, alongside the work that we're doing on dentistry, it's also about access to services, both dentistry and in terms of A&E, and that comes together in things like the 111 and how we review that, and also the NHS app. So it's looking at the front door, how we better manage demand, and that demand for dentistry is both through NHS dentistry, but it also often manifests itself at A&E, with a lot of patients going forward for dentistry at A&E as well.
Anna Firth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's plan this afternoon, in particular his focus on increasing capacity in urgent and emergency departments. I particularly welcome the government's recent investment of £8 million to reconfigure the A&E at my hospital in Southend. Would you agree this will increase not just the capacity but the quality of the urgent and emergency care on offer in Southend?
Well, I commend my honourable friend for her assiduous campaigning on behalf of her constituency in Southend, through which she has played a key role in securing the extra £8 million of funding, and she is right that that will make a material difference both to flow and capacity within the hospital and through that to the overall standard of patient care.
Jim Shannon.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his very clear commitment to extra funding for the urgent and emergency care recovery plan. But will the Secretary of State outline if he is prepared to make additional funding available to meet the needs of maternity wards, which midwives feel that they are teetering on the brink, and which in reality means life and death due to staffing levels? And will the Secretary of State ensure this additional funding makes its way to each devolved nation under the Barnett Consequential to be used before the scheduled new financial year ends? Thank you.
Well, as my honourable friend will know, through the Barnett Consequentials, the additional funding that the Chancellor announced in the autumn statement will lead to an uplift in health funding for Northern Ireland through the Barnett Consequentials. In terms of the flexibility within that, when I was Chief Secretary, he'll know that I agreed flexibility at that time. Of course, it will be for Treasury colleagues to look at what requirements there are for ongoing flexibility within Barnett Consequentials.
Thank you. Can I warmly welcome what my right honourable friend has said today, and say that he's right to recognise that one of the long-term impediments to discharge is the disconnect between NHS and social care and local authorities. To ensure the additional money is well spent, can he confirm that the ICBs will not only be responsible for the establishment of the hubs and the extra care packages, but they will be properly monitored and held responsible for their performance and generating value for the extra money that's being put in?
Well, my right honourable friend, as former Minister in the Department, speaks with great experience on these, and he's right that the crux of the plan is now in the delivery of it, and as I alluded to in my statement, a key component of that is having more transparency on the data, so that he and colleagues across the House can hold the ICBs to account, but also the local authorities, and to bring those two data sets more closely in alignment.
Defense Sec Ben.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I warmly welcome today's announcement, but I wonder if my right honourable friend could explain how, for remote rural hospitals like the fantastic North Devon District Hospital, the workforce challenges that were present pre-pandemic might be addressed post-pandemic when we are now also dealing with a housing crisis, and might there be an opportunity to expedite the next phase of their redevelopment programme, which actually includes key worker housing?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm very keen to explore with colleagues how we put more key worker accommodation onto the NHS estate, particularly making use of modern methods of construction to expedite that. In terms of the workforce plan, and Devon is an area that has seen a particular growth given its older population and greater pressure as a consequence, and those are pressures that will be worked through in the workforce plan that we're bringing forward shortly.
Can I ask the remaining members and those who are going to take part in the next statement, we're under a lot of pressure of time today, so please think of very short, focused, one single questions, please. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome this statement, the extra investment in the NHS? It was a privilege to visit Bournemouth Hospital recently and meet the dedicated staff. As the Secretary of State will know, it's expanding with a new A&E facility. So could I ask the Secretary of State to come and visit Bournemouth, meet the staff and see the progress taking place?
Well, subject to diary, Mr Deputy, I'm very keen to visit, and if not myself, then I'm sure a ministerial colleague will do so.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the £1 billion of funding announced today, and it's good to hear that hospitals have benefited from innovations like the patient flow control centres, care transfer hubs and virtual wards. So can my right honourable friend set out when hospitals and ICBs like Nottinghamshire, who have not been part of these pilots, will be able to access these innovations so that my constituents can start to access the benefits?
Well, they can start to access them now. So there is the 250 million we announced at the start of the month. There's part of the 500 million that was announced in the autumn statement, and they know that there is funding of 2.8 billion coming in terms of the new fiscal year. So there's an opportunity for them to move at pace.
Mr Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has told the House that the NHS was put under pressure with a spike in influenza cases in December. Could my right honourable friend tell the House where he thinks that influenza virus has been hiding for 2.5 years?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't think it's been hiding. The flu seasons are not uncommon in the NHS. They come around on a periodic basis. That is why, indeed, we anticipated it through the flu vaccine. But perhaps to his wider point, I think it's also recognised as a consequence of COVID, some resistance may have been lowered in terms of flu, but flu pressures on the NHS are things that we've had in past years as well.
Mr Pawsey.
Mr Speaker, I wonder whether the Secretary of State would consider more use of existing urgent care centres, such as at St Cross in Rugby. Our nearest full A&E is 12 miles away at UHCW in Coventry, which means that 83% of my constituents are more than 15 minutes drive away from A&E. And at Coventry, the hospital there serves a population of 600,000. That's twice the national average. So would he agree that extending provision at St Cross would go a long way to making a contribution towards reducing pressure at the hospital in Coventry?
Well, my honourable friend is right that not every patient accessing an emergency department needs a Tier 1 A&E facility, so it's about right place, right treatment in terms of the patient and making better use of urgent care centres and how they can better triage those patients that can be treated there is a key part of the plan we've set out.
Vickers.
Mr Deputy Speaker, in Stockton South we're incredibly grateful for the government's commitment to build a new diagnostic hospital so local people can get access to life-saving scans, tests and checks, and we're grateful for the £3 million announced to establish a new mental health crisis hub so that people can get support in their hour of need. But can my right honourable friend outline what he's doing to ensure that we have the right people with the right skills in the right place to deliver great service at these facilities?
Well, thanks to his assiduous campaigning, I'm delighted that he secured his diagnostic centre and also delighted, Mr Deputy Speaker, he assures me he is going to get it operational in one of the fastest times that any area has seen. In terms of workforce, we are bringing forward our workforce plan and as I said out in my statement, we've got 10,500 more nurses this year compared to last, and we're on track for our manifesto commitment of an extra 50,000 nurses with already over 30,000 recruited.
Mr Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I just take
My right honourable friend back to the response he gave to the member for Weaver Vale a moment ago with regards to Warrington Hospital. It is an A&E unit that is incredibly under pressure. I spoke to nurses over the weekend who talked to me about the 120 patients currently waiting to be discharged, which is putting intolerable pressure on the A&E unit. He said he wasn't particularly familiar with it. Perhaps I can invite him to Warrington to come and see the pressure there. And while he's there, perhaps he could also look at the Health and Social Care Academy that the local college has set up to try and address the shortage in social care. It certainly seems a great level of innovation that's happening there. I'm sure he'd like to see Warrington for himself.
Well, Mr. David, what may be the last question, he gives me a beautiful opportunity to correct an early answer, because I was just placing the honourable member's constituency. He knows I'm familiar with it, because I remember calling him about 10:30 one evening to discuss his A&E when there were some particular issues that had come to the attention of the media. So I am very familiar with the pressures on his hospital. I was just placing the honourable gentleman's constituency vis-à-vis my neighbours. So clarified on place, I am familiar with the fact it is under pressure, and I know the Minister of State is due to visit, and I'm sure she will look forward to meeting both members when she does so.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement and responding to questions for over an hour. We're now going to move on to the next statement. As I said, please, you can see how many people are standing, and we are likely to sit beyond midnight tonight, so please focus. Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And with your permission, I should like to make a statement which allows me to update the House on the government's progress in making buildings safe. It's a basic requirement of any civilised society that people should feel safe in their own homes. But for too many people, for far too long, that has not been the case. As I've said before, so I say again today, this has been a collective failure. Those in government who made the rules did not make them clear enough. Those who built our homes did not build them well enough. Those who made the materials which contributed to the construction of these homes often made them unsafe, at times knowingly. And those who were to check the work that was undertaken didn't always check thoroughly enough. And of course, those who own the buildings have sometimes managed them so poorly that people have been left unsafe, and too many of these owners have still shirked their obligations to make people safe. The only party to this crisis which does not share in the responsibility are the blameless leaseholders and the tenants who live in these buildings. That's why it's right that this Parliament protected these leaseholders through the Building Safety Act and apportioned financial responsibility more fairly. And we continue to work to make sure that those who bear the blame for this crisis also shoulder the burden of putting the situation right. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have made significant progress. Those who put unsafe material on people's homes must now pay, instead of the innocent residents living in them. Leaseholders need no longer fear financial ruin simply to make their homes safe. And the major mortgage lenders, thanks to their confidence in our new approach, will now lend on properties that are covered by the leaseholder protections in the Building Safety Act. And of course, they will also lend where the building is eligible for a government or developer remediation scheme. So leaseholders are no longer hostages of their mortgage arrangements. We have also reopened and turbocharged the Building Safety Fund for new applications, and we're piloting our medium-rise fund, paid for from a levy on developers, to ensure that dangerous cladding will be removed. Leaseholders can rest assured that their buildings will be made safe. And where remediation is required and building owners are sitting on their hands, even when money is being provided by the government, we will use powers under the Act to force the owners to fix their unsafe buildings. There should be no doubt there will be significant consequences for those who fail to comply with their legal obligations. Leaseholders should know the law is on their side, and today we make further progress on delivery. In April last year, I announced that the largest house builders had signed a pledge committing to fix all life-critical fire safety issues, internal and external, in buildings over 11 metres, which they had a role in developing or refurbishing in England. Developers also committed to reimburse the taxpayer where that work has already been done and subsidised by the taxpayer. In the summer, my department published the draft contract that will bind developers to honour that pledge. Since then, my officials have been working through that contract line by line to ensure that it codifies the pledge in a way that is fair and transparent, committing developers to fix buildings for which they are responsible as swiftly as possible, and therefore keeping residents and leaseholders informed about that work. I'm grateful to all of the developers who work with us and to the Home Builders Federation and, of course, their chairman, Stuart Paisley, who've worked so hard in order to make sure that this contract can deliver. And today we're publishing the final contract that I expect housing developers to sign. A copy of the contract has been deposited in the library of each house and is available on gov.uk. Let me be clear. If you're one of the developers that we invited to submit comments on the contract, I now expect you to sign it within the next 6 weeks, by March the 13th. That includes every company that signed the original pledge, as well as several companies that have regrettably not done so. Now is the time for all of them to make a binding commitment. This commitment will not only see them do right by those whose homes they've blighted so far, but it will also help them to maintain their credibility with those who may seek to contract with them or consider buying their homes in the future. Those who fail to step up and make this commitment will suffer the consequences that this Parliament has so clearly spelled out. Using powers provided by the Building Safety Act, I will lay regulations this spring to create a new responsible actors scheme. These regulations will set out which developers, by signing the contract, are eligible to be members. Those who built unsafe buildings, we expect to sign this contract. To join the scheme, they will have to sign and comply with the terms of the contract published today. And of course, we'll invite developers to join the scheme in order to ensure that we do right by leaseholders. Anyone who fails to sign the contract will be prohibited from carrying out future development and from receiving building control sign-offs for buildings under construction. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if you're a developer, if you fail to sign this contract, you will have to find another line of work. And I'm saying to all developers who've built unsafe buildings over 11 metres that I'm putting you on notice. You will be asked to step up. I will consult in due course on how we expand the responsible actors scheme to make sure that we capture all of those who built unsafe buildings and should now fix them. Altogether, I expect developer remediation to be worth more than £2 billion of investment in safety and will protect those in hundreds of buildings. I'm grateful to those in the development community who've got on with assessing and remediating their buildings without waiting for the final formal contract. I welcome their constructive engagement, but all developers should recognise that in signing this contract, they take a big step towards restoring confidence in the construction sector and providing much-needed certainty to all concerned. Those who sign will confirm that they're responsible companies, and I know from the positive discussions I've had that many are now keen to sign, and I want particularly to thank all those developers who have today confirmed that they will be signing. Accepting their new responsibilities will allow developers to plan ahead in the knowledge that they now understand the full extent of their legal obligations. When these buildings are safe,